Okay, so I'm going to introduce our the NACC team that's presenting today. I'm going to start with Dr. Stately because he's an elder. Go ahead, Dr. Stately.
Thank you for that. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon now. I'm Antony Stately. I'm the president and executive officer of the Native American Community Clinic. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and a descendant of the Great Red Lake and White Earth Nations of Minnesota.
Thank you, Rich. And Michelle.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Michelle Corcoran. I'm the nurse manager for the MAT program at NACC.
Thank you, Rich. Tina.
I'm Tina. I'm the HIV non-medical case manager at NACC.
Rich, thank you. And I'm Kari Rabi. I'm a family practice and addiction medicine physician working here with the program at NACC. So if we could start the slides, please.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is, of course, the Midwest Tribal Echo. And yeah, thank you. And so this is our agenda for today. Renee did our prayer and land acknowledgement for us today. I'm going through the introductions and agenda. I'll cover the Zoom guidelines. Tina will be doing our announcements. Dr. Stately will be presenting the didactic today, and then we will close. Next slide, please. So Zoom, please let us know who you are. You can introduce yourself in the chat function. We'd like to get your name, title, organization, and email. And please update your name on the screen. You can right-click and rename yourself in your little Hollywood square. We would really appreciate it if everybody who can would turn on their camera so we can see you. It just makes the conversation more smooth. Please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. If we do start to hear noise coming from you, we might mute you for you, and please don't take offense. Use the chat or hand raise function for attention if you need it, and please no protected health information. Tina, could you please do the announcements?
Yeah, so just a reminder that we meet every first and third Wednesday of each month from noon to 1 p.m. Upcoming sessions. So the next one will be January 19th. Michelle Corcoran will be talking about dual pathway MAT, dosing and direct prescribe. And then on February 2nd, there will be a presentation by myself and James Schmidt on syringe exchange services. Another echo happening with Stratus Health is the Opioid Use Disorder Education and Treatment Echo Series with Dr. Heather Bell and Kurt Devine, and that happens on the first and third Tuesdays of each month from 12:15 to 1:15. If you want to, I think that you have to pre-register for this, so if you want to attend these, please let me know and I can send you information. They recently did a medication for opioid use disorder treatment virtual boot camp. It was a boot camp that they hosted live, but they recorded everything, and it's about 4 hours total. It's on YouTube, and the link is on this presentation, but if anyone wants the link, I can just send it to you in the chat or via email. So case presentations are a great time to present sort of hypothetical or real life situations at the end of our didactic sessions. Anyone can propose a case presentation. Just let me know if you have anything you want to bring to the table. Today we have a case presentation. However, we don't always have time to talk about them. So yeah, keep that in mind. Continuing education credits are available for this echo. I will be sending out a survey at the end of this session. And so if you want CMEs, you'll have to complete that survey. And sorry, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Dr. Stately now. Saw you, Dr. Stately.
Oh, sorry, I'm on mute. My new middle name, you're on mute. Yeah, are you able to see it on the screen, correct?
Yes, but you should start the slideshow because we're seeing the side slides as well.
Yeah, let's see here. Okay, there you go. Okay. So this is me. This is the title of the talk. You can read that. You don't need me to say it for you. Here. So I like to start the talk by sort of contextualizing like who we are, where we're at, who we're serving. There's in the state of Minnesota, there are 11 tribal nations. Tribal nations are considered sovereign entities, sovereign nations. The relationship with the state and with the federal government is the same as if like, the same relationship that they have between like the United States and Canada and the like. Sovereign nations are able to self-determine their health, their and all kinds of other the range of their sort of like the impact of all kinds of things and aspects of their life and their health and well-being and their day-to-day living. So just like any other nation, they get to make those decisions independently of often independently of government, U.S. government or state government interference. There are 7 Ojibwe nations, or Anishinaabe nations, to the north of the Twin Cities, where we are situated, and there are 4 Dakota reservations to the south and to the west of us. This is a from the 2010 census. Hopefully we'll very soon here have an updated census map of Minneapolis and the surrounding metropolitan area, but it shows you very clearly the amount of Native people that live in the metropolitan area, significantly greater than many of the other red metropolitan areas across the country. In fact, actually, the Twin Cities has, specifically in South Minneapolis, has the distinction of being the densest and most populated Native urban population in the United States at the moment. I like to tell people that, one of the things we take a look at across the spectrum of practically anything that can be measured in terms of health and social well-being across many of the metrics that we consider to be sort of meaningful and hopeful. I mean, meaningful and informative, or in terms specifically around social determinants of health and the related factors therewith. We have some of the worst outcomes around social, economic, and health indicators. Oh, sorry, I'm having a hard time advancing the slide because the thing disappears. The little arrow, the magic arrow. Native American mental health, we'll take a look at those factors. We have about the distribution of disorders among Native American people with respect to mental health disorders is about the same. The thing as the general population, the important thing to sort of kind of take note of and think about is that we have many of the disorders we have at greater prevalence and then also greater severity. Greater prevalence, is sort of like over the spans of lifetime. Incidence is different from prevalence. Prevalence is the overall lifetime accumulation of disorders within a population. There is overwhelming evidence that we have a greater prevalence of some of the mental health disorders, particularly those that are related specifically to trauma or have their roots in trauma, and greater severity. Greater severity is an important thing to think about, because what we do know about practically just like mental health, like chronic disease and mental health is a chronic disease, as is substance abuse. The severity of the disease worsens over time. So the longer it takes somebody to be identified as having a condition, are the precursors to a condition, and getting support and services for that condition, the worse it gets over their lifetime. So in generally speaking, in the general population, as a nation, we do a very poor job of identifying people early in their lives, so as children and as adolescents, for conditions that are mental health, including substance abuse. And that's true of the general population. We do a much worse job of identifying those conditions in the Native American community. So the severity of conditions by the time that people have lived with a condition for 20, 30, 40 years is significantly greater than it would necessarily be if we were better at identifying things early. I like to show this slide because it gives you an understanding of how significant the impact of poverty is among Native American people across the nation. This is certainly true of the Native people we serve in the metropolitan area and throughout the state of Minnesota. We have poverty levels that are 2 to 3 times greater in our communities than they are in the general population. And of course, poverty is a great significant indicator of poor health outcomes in our community. So I just start with that because that's a really important contextual backdrop to sort of understand as we begin to talk a little bit about historical trauma and its impact on Native people and their health and well-being. This is a conceptual model of historical trauma that is pulled from an article by Maria Sotero. I think it's called, the name of the article is A Framework for Understanding Historical Traumatic Stress, something like that. This article, actually, if you Google Maria Sotero's name and also the terms historical trauma, this article is available for your consumption and reading pleasure through the open press, through open articles. You can just Google it and pull it up and be able to read it at your own leisure. How do I get this thing to disappear? Does anybody know? This right in the middle of my screen. Sorry. So I like to show this conceptual model because I think it helps us to sort of understand what we mean when we talk about historical trauma. So historical trauma is not something specifically that only Native American people in the United States have experienced. In fact, actually, many groups across the globe have experienced historically traumatic events throughout history. Some of these events are happening right now as we speak. So we think about mass traumatic events that are happening to a subjugated population that's perpetrated upon them by a dominant group, either intentionally or unintentionally through intentionally would be like acts of war and those kinds of things, and then acts of genocide, and then unintentional would be things like cultural genocide and those kinds of things where policies and decisions are made about resources or the lack of resources that have significant impact on a group. And those things are happening right now in our current sort of situation across the globe. One of the things that this diagram or this graph helps you to understand is when we talk about mass traumatic events, we're talking about a mass traumatic event or a series of mass traumatic events that are directly or indirectly directed at a small impact a subjugated population by actions or decisions or policies that are made from a dominant group, have a specific they segregate and displace people. They result in physical and psychological violence, arguably cultural violence as well, economic and destruction, and physical destruction, and also cultural and spiritual disposition. One of the primary criticism that I have of Sotero's article is that she does not really address the impact of these events on the spiritual health or well-being of Indigenous groups, and specifically within the Native community. That's a big part of like what we talk about and focus on our work on when we look at healing from mass traumatic events, is that sort of like that impact on our spirit. And when we think about historical trauma, one of the things that we know is that, of course, the first generation of individuals that are exposed to these mass traumatic events have great and significant impact on it. The trauma response is usually similar to what we sort of like see in like the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnostic sectorally. I think, again, arguably, Sotero leaves out sort of like the whole conversation around spiritual impact in terms of a trauma response. And then what we know is that trauma doesn't just impact that first generation. Research has actually, over the last 20 years, has been very good at demonstrating the transmission of traumatic response from one generation to the second and subsequent generations through all kinds of mechanisms. There are actually now research projects that have demonstrated that there's biological mechanisms for the transmission of trauma, genetic markers that sort of like have leave an impact on people's functioning and well-being through, the trauma response network in your brain. One of the things that I sort of introduce in this conversation when we talk about historical trauma as it relates specifically to Indigenous people of the United States, and we're talking specifically here about folks living in, Native Americans living in the metropolitan area, is the role that Manifest Destiny had in sort of as a policy and as a practice, had a role in shaping the events that sort of like impacted tribal communities throughout the 1800s, the 17th century and the 18th century, or 18th century and 19th century, sorry. So the foundation, this is if you Google the term Manifest Destiny and then you click on the term that says images, this image pops up as being the sort of like main image of the embodiment of Manifest Destiny as a principle or as a policy, as a framework for thinking. This piece of art was actually a piece of propaganda there was an artist that was commissioned to sort of like, distill all the philosophical underpinnings of Manifest Destiny as a policy and as a practice. And sort of kind of, it was used as actual physical propaganda to generate support, so like you think now about it was the Facebook of the 17th century or the 18th century rather, so like the late 1700s, early 1800s, like encourage westward expansion. You can see in the image here is there's this very Zoptic, kind of angelic floating white woman in godlike robes. She's carrying a good book in her hand, and she's stringing telegraph wire as she sort of moves from the eastern part of the United States across the plains and into the west. And in the darker area over here, which is really kind of hard to see, you can see like buffalo and other wild animals, and then Indians, Native Americans on horseback running away from the wagons and the train and these men holding hoes, which also is a statement about how important westward expansion and the expansion of agriculture as the primary method and way of sort of like introducing quote unquote progress was a big part of this sort of whole philosophy. You look up the definition of Manifest Destiny. Embedded within that definition is the key principle that Western Europeans or white people who came from Europe to the Americas were imbued with the God-given right to subdue the land and to make the fruits of the land support their westward expansion and progress and it was a key element in the whole sort of like foundation of atrocities that then sort of kind of like were perpetrated across tribal communities and across the United States over the next 150, 200 years after that. I think also embedded within sort of like the foundation of what helped the United States. I cannot move this navigation bar. It's really pissing me off. Sorry. Oh, sorry. We're recording, aren't we? It's making me upset.
Is it your Zoom navigation bar?
Yeah, it's like right in the middle of my screen. When I try to grab it and move it, it won't go away.
Oh, you won't let you drag it?
It won't let me drag it. When I try to click on it, like it clicks on the screen and it makes me, oh, there we go. Here, I found it. Sorry about that. This is a key piece of making sure that you know that your speaker knows how to navigate this stuff before you let them get on the screen and talk. Anyway, I apologize. So this is also a graphic from the mid 1800s to late 1800s that is, I think, a really meaningful piece of propaganda as well. It's like here we have like this, you know, European white man standing in amongst, you know, Black and Indigenous and Asian and South American, Central American individuals who have, you know, their own tools that they that are important and meaningful to their existence and to their livelihood and to their and who they are as cultural people. And he's holding up this, you know, this really symbolic sort of iconic piece of imagery that is the railroad, right? Which ironically, like, you know, Indigenous people built the railroad, right? And that's not something we often think about. In fact, actually, I just remember like the other day, like I just parenthetically say this to my son, she was like saying like, you know, well, white people made the world the way it is today. And I said, well, that's a really broad statement. Let's kind of break that apart here. I said, actually, when you think about, you know, their money and their wealth did, but that was money and wealth that was taken from us, from our land and the resources that we had as Indigenous people. And ironically, they enslaved us and they did all kinds of things to us as well. And we actually built the infrastructure of this nation in the 18 and 1900s. So the actual roads that they drive on, the trains that they ride on, and all those other things, those were built by Indigenous people, either from this land or from another land. So just want to make that clear. And I think one of the things that's really important is like, you know, embedded in this principle of like manifest destiny is also this idea of like, you know, we are the superior race. And so the things that are important to us, these tools and these you know, mechanics and our ideologies and all these other are far superior to the other people who were actually already here embodying and living on the land. And so it's a key sort of like philosophical underpinning of what unfolds after that, which is, you know, if you fully believe this to be true, and you embrace the ideology of manifest destiny, it lays the foundation for allowing you to do horrible and unspeakable things to the Indigenous people of this land or any other land that you sort of that you quote unquote discover, right? So let's talk about the historically traumatic events that happened to Native people in the United States, including here in the state of Minnesota, which is this laundry list of things that happened, right? And I think it's parenthetically, it's also really important to understand that it wasn't just one or two events that happened. It was a series of events over multiple generations that impacted Native people. So, and in some ways, in some cases, these things still happen to us, right? And so even the term historical trauma is a little bit of a misnomer, right? When we talk about some of these things, meaning that, you know, and the reason I say that is because, you know, I have had actually contemporaneous conversations with colleagues, like when I used to work in research at the University of Washington, you know, about 15, 16 years ago. I would have colleagues say to me like, well, you know, help us to understand, like, why is this important? Like, these were historical things that happened. You know, it's now, you know, 2006. Why are we so concerned about these things? Like, well, let's talk about that. And, you know, the historical, in this way, it's important to understand that some of these things are still happening to our people in very everyday ways. They don't necessarily show up in the same ways that they did in the 1800s and the 1900s, but they're things that are embedded within policies and practices within institutions that have become codified, including healthcare. And when we have those experiences as Native people, where we see reminders of the things that were actually traumatic events to our people, if we individually or collectively haven't worked through those traumatic events and come to a space and place of understanding and accepting and having sort of resolved the impact that it had on us, either individually or collectively, whenever we have things that happen to us in the environment that remind us of those events, it evokes a response. It's like it finds that trauma response button within our sort of nervous system. It pushes the button and we end up having a response, sometimes mild, but sometimes very strong response. One of the things I like to talk about when I talk about trauma response and how it shows up and it becomes evident in our daily lives today, both as just sort of like members of the community, but also within healthcare, when we see people, or other service industries, when we see people come into our community come from the community for us and ask us for help, is this is one of the things that I think is the most important traumatic event, and that's certainly not the only one, but a real prominent and noteworthy traumatic event that happened to the Dakota people, or that practically pretty much right now in 2021 or 2022 now, most Minnesotans know that there was a war about 159 years ago in the state of Minnesota that involved the United States and the state of Minnesota and the Dakota people, who were the rightful owners of the land at one time, right? And that was the U.S. Dakota War. They know about the concentration camp, or the internment of Dakota women, children, and elders at Fort Snelling, which is still fairly vibrant in our right here in the Twin Cities, and fairly active. Now, the Historical Society, who actually operates the Fort Snelling in Minneapolis, has in recent times done a good job of sort of like being more transparent about the U.S. Dakota War and its impact on Dakota people, and telling the truth about that history than it has historically been. And so many more people know about that, and they understand. They've even gone as far as renaming this area, which you see here in this picture, which is Bedote, which is a spiritual center for the Dakota people. And their creation stories, they talk about emerging into the world from Bedote, from the convergence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. This Minnesota Historical Society in recent years has renamed this space Bedote at Fort Snelling, right? Acknowledging the importance and the spiritual and cultural significance of this space to Dakota people, and the impact that the U.S. war had on Dakota people. many people in Minnesota now, but also many don't, because this is not until fairly recent times, something that we taught in our history curriculum in the state of Minnesota in any of our public schools. In fact, I tell people all the time that, I grew up in the Twin Cities. I was born and raised in South Minneapolis. I went to school at South High. I graduated from there. I went to university at McAllister for two and a half years before moving away. And I was probably a 35, 40-year-old man before I heard about the U.S.-Dakota War in 1862. Now that's really, really important information, because I consider myself to be a fairly well-educated and informed individual. But for me not to know about this war, this is how good of a job we have done as a society of erasing this information from our history, right? As a state even. And not being transparent about the atrocity and the impact that it had on Dakota people, and from a historical context, or even from a contemporaneous context, like meaning here and now. But this has and remains the distinction of being the largest mass execution of any human beings by the government. By government action and decision in the United States. The hanging of the 38 Dakota men who had been found to have some involvement in the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. And if you don't know much about the U.S.-Dakota War, you can Google it and find a lot of information online about it now, much more than you could like 10 or 15 years ago even. But in effect, this was, I like to speak about this because I use it as a way of sort of articulating like how something that happened, an atrocity that happened, 1 or 2 generations ago, kind of still remains in our psychology, our communal psychology, and in our spirit. And when we have events that happen that remind us of these things, how it sort of impacts us as individuals in the community, it's a really good example of like what we mean by having a trauma response. Another thing that sort of was really atrocious that happened in Native people, that's a historical traumatic event, is the boarding school era, or what this could also be thought of as a policy and a practice that involved forced assimilation. For about 100 years, from like about 1890, both formal policy and practice to sort of less formal policy and practice, Native people were taken from their families and from their home communities and sent to institutions that were primarily designed from the ground up to be institutions that were focused less on education and more on, forcing Native people to become, adopt the practices and the, including spiritual practices of the dominant culture. So the man who came up with this idea for boarding schools, General Richard Pratt, was famous for saying the words, "Kill the Indian and save the man," meaning like do everything you can to annihilate anything about this individual, this man or this woman who that makes them indigenous, including their cultural life ways, the way they practice their spiritual health and well-being, all these kinds of things. Strip them of that and make them into copies of us. It's hard to see this image here, but because it's so faint and I don't know why. It doesn't show up that way usually when I give this talk, but this is a picture of Tom Torlino, who was a Navajo man who was removed from his family and sent thousands of miles away to Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It is one of the first institutions that opened during the boarding school era. And this is a picture of him 3 months later. And I love seeing these pictures side by side because I think it demonstrably indicates like how effective of a job, at least from the outside, that these institutions did on stripping people of their indigeneity and their ideology of who they are and their understanding of who they were as Native people. As a formal policy, it spanned about 50 or 60 years, but continued in practice all the way up until like the 70s and 80s. I would like to tell people that I disclose usually in this conversation that I myself am a boarding school, what's quote unquote called about a boarding school survivor, meaning I'm going to shut off my notifications. Dang it. Anyway, I apologize if you're hearing that. And I was a boarding school survivor, and my mother and father were boarding school survivors. My grandparents were boarding school survivors, and their parents were boarding school survivors. So like I'm a 4th generation boarding school survivor. And I like to tell people that because I think, again, it hits home and it hits the nail on the head about the conversation about that, like the Dakota War, this was not that long ago, boarding school impacted our communities as recently as my own life, and then the lives of some of my cousins and some of my nieces and nephews who continued to go to boarding school even after I was no longer there. But in those institutions, that were run a lot like penal colonies, because a lot of the staff and the people who were sort of recruited to run those facilities were actually recruited from the former military and other institutions that were sort of like not really training them to sort of kind of care for children, but to sort of like, use them as indentured slaves. What we now know is that Native children experienced horrific and tremendous atrocities within those institutions. And we also know now from just a lot of the recent news that's been shared about unmarked graves that have been found in Canada, and also more recently unmarked graves that have been found across the United States, even here in Minnesota, is that there were a great number of Native children who died in these institutions and were buried in unmarked graves, and their remains were never, and even their death was never something that was shared with their families and their parents. What I like to tell people to sort of just amplify that is I want you to imagine for yourself, if you're a parent or if you were a child, and all of you were children because you were born, imagine being ripped from your families or having your children ripped from your family and without your permission and sent thousands of miles away, where they lived for 5, 10, 15 years. Maybe some of them never returned, but when they did return, they couldn't speak your language. They didn't understand your customs. You had no way of sort of like, really communicating and sharing any information with them, your feelings, your thoughts, any of those things. That's the context in which we're talking about the impact. It is perhaps one of the most pervasive impacts that we have on our communities today, is the sort of the unraveling of family health and well-being and dynamics, those connectedness, those kinship ties, and the impact that had on our communities over time. Contemporary historically traumatic events include relocation. This has great significance. The problem that we're seeing within the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul and across the state with the number of Native people specifically who are homeless, unsheltered homeless. So in the 50s and the 60s, the United States unveiled a policy called the relocation policy. Tribal communities and tribal folks living on reservations were incentivized, promised things like jobs, education, homes, a brighter future, all of these things that are important to Western society, promised all of these things if they moved from their home reservations to relocation cities. And relocation cities were places like Los Angeles, Seattle, large cities, New York, Chicago, Minneapolis was a relocation center, Milwaukee, those places, all across the United States. And when people were relocated from their homes reservation to a metropolitan area, oftentimes they were moved moved thousands of miles away or hundreds of miles away from their home reservation. Now, some of that was done by design so that you would disrupt the relationship that the individual had with their families and also with their homeland, and putting them into environments where they sort of were forced to quote unquote assimilate and adapt. Now, it was a failed policy because what we see across all kinds of urban centers across the United States is we see large numbers of Native people who are homeless and homeless generationally, meaning they themselves are homeless, their parents were homeless, their grandparents were homeless, either chronically or intermittently, right? And that's what happens to tribal people when you separate them from each other and you separate them from their homelands, is that it makes them very vulnerable. We're seeing that now, not just in Minneapolis, but in places like Seattle and Los Angeles and New York, right? Large homeless camps that are very much, have a high population of Native American people living in those unsheltered homeless environments. And then child removal through boarding school isn't necessarily happening anymore, but we have a very high rate of child removal through child welfare policies that are greatly impacting Native American communities. In the late 1970s, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, and that was as a result of recognizing that over the course of several generations and over the course of at least 60 years after boarding school policy was recognized to be a failed policy, and the laws changed and made it unlawful to steal Native children from their families and the communities and put them into boarding school. We recognize that policies around child safety and child well-being and child welfare there were significant racial disparities as it was related to Black children, but also to Native American children, where we saw upwards of 30 to 40% of Native children removed from their homes and raised by white families, never returning to their families and never returning to their communities. So the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in the late 1970s, and actually Minneapolis is the center of much of the movement that was done around sort of laying the groundwork for the Indian Child Welfare Act in the early 70s through public action and protest and community activism. And what's really disturbing to me, because I grew up in the area, my mother was very involved in the Indian Child Welfare Act sort of movement. Is what's painful for me emotionally and psychologically and spiritually is that we see some of the highest rates of child removal from Native families and Native homes today than we saw even at the levels of the 1970s. And that has a lot to do with the policies around the protection of children as it relates specifically to substance use disorder. Like over the last 15, 20 years, opiate use disorder and its impact in our communities and the impact that it's been having on families means that a lot of Native children are being removed from their homes and either being raised by their grandparents or being raised out of their homes and out of their communities by people because of this failed policy. What happens when you think about, one way of thinking about the impact of historically traumatic events and some of the contemporaneous things is that, when you have a people in the community that have been, have lost the access to their land, historically lost access to their cultural life ways, historically and contemporaneously lost access to the practice of their traditional healing methods, so our ceremonies. One of the first things that happened to us through colonization and after pre-contact was, I want you to remember like what puritanical times did to people that practiced quote unquote witchcraft in, like, not just in Europe, but also in the Eastern Seaboard, is those people were persecuted, right, and put to death. And that was, and those practices were things that happened in indigenous communities as well. So if you practiced your spiritual ways, which were clearly in conflict, direct opposition to Christianity and other forms of quote unquote religion of the Western culture, you oftentimes were either imprisoned or you could be killed for practicing those things. So a lot of our spiritual practices went underground, and in some ways, many of those things were directly outlined by federal or state law. And so people didn't practice their spiritual practices for many, many decades, right? Those are the things, those spiritual practices and those ceremonies, like our language, like our food, and like all these other things that are part of who make up who we are as Indigenous people, those things were lost. They were outlawed specifically. So we have a whole bunch of traumatic events that happened to us. We have no access to our traditional ways of healing. There was not a big, huge public health service industry delivering therapy or other type of forms of intervention to people in reservation communities in the late 1900s or the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so you had a lot of Native people who were walking around with spiritual, emotional, psychological, and oftentimes physical harm, and resulting in things like anger, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a bunch of other things. Within that context, substance use and other forms of coping make a lot of sense, right? In this diagram, this is a diagram that a colleague of mine used in her dissertation because she studied historical trauma in graduate school. She called it maladaptive. When I tell people like what's the difference, I used to do training I used to teach in graduate school, and I would also train psychology students, and I would always ask them this question: what's the difference between an adaptive coping mechanism and a maladaptive coping mechanism? And I'd sit there and watch them, and they'd be like, they'd offer up these like really interesting definitions of what those things are. Some would be Freudian, some would be all these really weird things. And I said, well, let's just keep it simple. An adaptive coping mechanism is one that makes sense within the context in which you currently live. Like it's a mechanism that you create, or as a group of people you create, that helps you to survive the conditions in which you're living in right now. 100 years ago, some of these things made a lot of sense because things were pretty bad. 200 years ago, they were even worse, right? You change context and you switch into modern times. Some of the mechanisms that we use to cope with some of these horrific events, they don't make a lot of sense to us right now because we don't live in the same time necessarily. And what happens within that context is you have generations of individuals and communities over time, functioning in this way, using substances and other kinds of ways of adapting to the conditions of their lives, much of which has not been under their control or their choice, right? We like to think about sometimes these things as being life choices that people make, when in fact, actually a lot of it is not necessarily their life choice. What happens after... Yeah, I'm gonna finish this up really quickly. Okay. So what happens is you have erosion of family ties and tribal ties that then lead to significantly greater risk for the individuals within the community, because you have violence and stress that continues within individual interactions, within family systems, and even within the community itself. So the whole entire community begins to sort of erode and fall apart mostly because of the amount of trauma and stress that they've been dealing with. And they also have not necessarily had access to the things that would help them, right? They've had access to Western intervention, but not any access to their traditional ways that sort of help them historically throughout their lifetimes. And that is a big contribution to the way in which things are looking for us right now in our community, right? I'm going to stop the slideshow here right now. But one of the things I want to just say really quickly is that I want us to think about, how do I stop sharing? I don't know how to do that.
Should be down in the bottom. There should be like in the middle, or the bar that you had to move.
Yeah.
That should say stop share.
Oh, okay. It says new share. I don't know how to do that. Can't you just take it away from me? Just kidding.
I could try.
I don't know how to do it. Sorry.
Oh, I can do it.
Okay.
I found it.
There you go. Good job. Thank you. So I almost made a really bad joke, like, be a colonizer and just take it away from me.
You did.
But
You just did, and it was good.
I know. So one of the things I want to sort of like nail this down is that, like, hopefully what I've done is I've painted for you an understanding of like not just the historical context, but also like what's happening right now, right? Like how the things that have happened over the last 3-4 generations sort of like show up in the individuals in our community right now today, right? Like we have in Minneapolis and in Minnesota, 1 out of 4 homeless individuals in the state of Minnesota are Native American, right? But we only represent 1% of the population of the state, and also about 2% of the population of the United States, somewhere between 1 and 2%. But we show up in rates of the homeless people. We show up in rates of people living with HIV. We show up in overdose rates at 17, 20 times the amount of impact that it has on the general population. So these inequities, people call these disparities. I call these inequities because that's what they are. These inequities are embedded in historical actions that were made, 50, 100, 200, 300 years ago, right? Policies that sort of were laid down, that laid the foundation for all kinds of horrific things that unfolded over the next 200 years, things that are still showing up in policies and practices contemporaneously right now that we still do, right? This is the space and place in which NACC tries to sort of shape the understanding of those things, and then also position the importance of cultural healing within the framework of Indigenous well-being within a Western model of service, right? That's one of the reasons why we center culture in the work that we do around substance use and the opioid use disorder, and practically everything else that we do. Any questions?
Right on time, right on the dot.
Yeah, and that might have been a really bad joke to call. Sorry.
No, it was
Just be a colonizer and take it away from me.
I think it was very appropriate.
So yeah, well, like these are and I think one of the things I also want to just be really clear here is like, it's like, these are that sense of humor that Indigenous people have about this. It's like sometimes we have to make jokes, right? It's like we walk around every single day with reminders of these things, of this history, but also we walk around with reminders of like, oh yeah, like, some of these things, I didn't make life choices about these things. These were policies and things that sort of have a direct impact on me and my children, and I made no decisions about it, right? And sometimes you have to crack jokes and make jokes about it because, if you don't laugh about it, man, you just might sit down and, I don't know, cry, get drunk, self-harm yourself anyway, all kinds of things, right? So it's a real thing. I mean, we have to begin to sort of start to acknowledge it and try to do our best as practitioners and as people who make decisions like me about health systems, about like, how do we see these things showing up in our daily work, and how do we begin to sort of like undo them, right? It's a really intentional process. So.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stately. We really appreciate having you here to speak with us about this. Just a quick ask for any questions. I know we're over time. Anybody have any questions or comments? I think you covered it, Dr. Stately.
Yeah, you can put my email in the chat. People can always email me if they have questions.
Thank
So
you.
anyway, I want to thank you all for your work you do. What you do is meaningful and important to the community. It's actually very meaningful and important to me. Many of the people that I speak of when I talk about the relatives in our community are actually my relatives. I have nieces and nephews who are homeless and living in those encampments. So the work you do impacts them, and it has a direct impact on me every single day. So Shimigwich Pinami Wopida for the things that you do. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Dr. Stately.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.